Mixtape with Scott. I am Scott Cunningham, the host. I'm a professor at Baylor University in the economics department, and this is a podcast devoted to listening to the stories, personal stories of living economists, as well as telling a tale, an oral history of the economics profession over the last 50 years. In today's episode, I have the honor of having as a guest Eric Glen Weyl, or E. Glen Weyl. You oftentimes see him as E. Glen Weyl. Glen did his PhD, his undergraduate and his PhD at Princeton University, then went to Harvard Society of Fellows, then went to the University of Chicago as an assistant professor, where he was mentored by people like Stephen Levitt and Gary Becker. But then he ended up leaving academia entirely and going into work at Microsoft, where his career has kind of blossomed into a very interesting new direction. He is the founder and the research lead of the Microsoft Research Special Project, the Plural Technology Collaboratory, and he also founded and served as board chair of the Plurality Institute, founded and served on the board of the Radical Exchange Foundation. I have here a paragraph I could keep going. So he also in 2018 wrote a book with Eric Posner that probably you're familiar with, Radical Markets, Uprooting Democracy, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. And he's got a new book coming out later in May with Audrey Tang, or Audrey Tang, I think is the correct. That's probably not correct either. Plurality, Technology for Cooperative Diversity and Democracy. It was written as an open Git-based collaboration. He's a fascinating man. I told him in many ways he reminds me of a lot of the classic economists that were also philosophers. He's big ideas, big thinker, and that's just sort of a superficial way of describing the conversation that we had. But it was also very inspiring, and I hope that those of you listening will feel a little encouraged and a little excited to hear that there is that the future is not written for you. There is an infinite number of possibilities that you can go forward with in economics, and in fact, leaping out of economics, that is turning out to be more and more part of the story of the last 50 years of the profession. So I want to thank Glen for being on the show and for his candidness and for his generosity and sharing his personal story. And I want to turn it over to the other Scott Cunningham, who is no longer with us. He was there about 15 minutes ago. Now he's gone. I've replaced him. I'm a little bit of a copy of him, and then Glen. Thank you so much for turning in. If you like this episode, please share it, give it to other people. Thanks a lot. Well, it's a pleasure to have on the show someone who I've only known by reputation and from a distance. Guest, would you mind telling us your full name, your full title, and the name of the firm that pays your paycheck?
Sure. Great to meet you, Scott. I'm Eric Glen Weyl, E. Glen Weyl, and I work at Microsoft Corporation. I am the research lead of something called the Plural Technology Collaboratory, which is a special project in Microsoft Research. And I also am founder of a couple of nonprofits, the Radical Exchange Foundation and Plurality Institute. And most recently, I'm leading this book project that comes out right about when this podcast comes out, I guess. So maybe we'll
Awesome.
talk about that a little bit.
I can't wait to hear about that as we move on. Well, before we get started, was wanting to do an icebreaker. If you think back as far as you can go, what's a vacation that you went on that since then you've thought about it, a couple of times? It doesn't have to be your favorite one. It doesn't even have to be when you were a kid, but you've just noticed that it just pops into your mind every now and then.
Uh, I think probably the most memorable for me was when I went to Europe when I was quite young, probably 10 or 11. And I was obsessed with rollerblading at the time. I still am to some extent. And I was with my grandmother. Actually, I have two experiences with rollerblading there. One was that I was with my grandmother and I insisted that I wanted to rollerblade down the Champs-Élysées
Ah.
in, and she had to help me track down rollerblades to rent in some part of Paris. And then we went to the Netherlands, and I did manage to find rollerblades there. I went rollerblading through one of the parks, and it was during the campaign. And
Ah.
I met one of the representatives of one of the parties there, and I like expanded my understanding of the political spectrum. There's this notion called social liberalism in Europe, which we could talk about. But anyway, I met a representative of one of these parties, and that then shaped my future political thought. So I had two
Oh.
very unusual experiences with rollerblading in two different cities in Europe.
Oh, wow. Do you were your parents as kind of uh sort of connected to this, democratic ideals as you've kind of become?
My parents were much more in the tech world.
Ah.
My cousins and grandparents were more politically engaged than
Mm.
my parents were.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But my mother eventually got there. So my mother eventually ended up being one of the top fundraisers for Hillary Clinton and serving in the State Department. So
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, all right. Well, let's get started. So, well, tell me, where did you grow up and what did your parents, you sort of mentioned what your parents did for a living, but where did you grow up?
I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, mostly in Palo Alto and the surroundings. I then was briefly in New York and I ended up going to boarding school. But
Mm.
about 10 years, the largest chunk of my childhood was in Palo Alto and the surroundings.
Yeah. Do you have any siblings?
I have a younger sister who's an artist in New York City.
Oh, cool. Cool. Well, what kind of stuff is there to do when you're a kid in Palo Alto? What kind of stuff do you like to do?
Palo Alto is, uh, you know, on the one hand, it's like the center of the tech universe. And so obviously there was all kinds of technology stuff. My parents were in the tech industry, is very aware of that. And you're around these children that are connected to the tech world or to Stanford. Many of them end up doing kind of pretty amazing things.
Hmm.
And at the same time, it's not really how it felt as an atmosphere to me when I was young. I was, picked on quite a bit.
Hmm.
Didn't feel totally at home in that atmosphere. I
Hmm.
also, Palo Alto, despite being sort of very central in the tech world, feels very suburban, doesn't feel that connected to San Francisco. So for me, it was actually weirdly, challenging, even though it was supposedly this center of the tech world. There's also a very difficult history, especially where I was living and more broadly in Palo Alto, of the attempts to integrate the schools with the adjacent East Palo Alto, which was one of the poorest places in
Hmm.
the country at the time. I don't know if you've seen the film Dangerous Minds, but it's about East
Oh,
Palo Alto. And a
that's the
few
one with
blocks
Michelle
away,
Pfeiffer?
exactly, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And a few blocks away from where I grew up, even though we were very well off, was the largest drug bust. I think about 850 people were arrested
Huh.
in the United States during the decade of the 1990s.
Ah.
So there was a very tense situation there.
You
And
felt it as a little kid too, like middle school?
absolutely. And it was, on the one hand, it was an integrated school, and I had a number of friends who came from the other side. And at the same time, there was a lot of pressure not to associate with those people, that it was dangerous there, that you couldn't visit them.
Hmm.
Um, and, you know, I very vividly feel my own sort of like, racial reactions and prejudices
Hmm.
having formed during that period in my youth, especially given that I was initially friends with them and then I was pushed not to be, and then had bullying, but was the bullying a result precisely of the ways I was being pushed to ostracize and
Hmm.
other, so anyways, it was an interesting
That sounds like a lot to
learning curve.
navigate for. That's a lot to navigate for a little kid. That's a lot to navigate for anybody.
Yeah. So anyway.
Well, so if I could have like, been a fly on the wall when you were like 7 or 8 years old and it's a Saturday, what would I have found you probably doing on a random Saturday?
So at that particular age of seven, 6, 7, I was very into politics. So I was
Oh,
actually campaigning for Bill Clinton in the
ah,
1992 election. And I ended up, because I did that and went by the house of a Stanford professor who did a public access television show, I ended up on television at 7
wow.
for my campaigning around the neighborhood. So I was very involved in politics early and in many different ways, as we'll go through. I sort of spanned many different positions, but was always very active in politics, really starting at the age of 7 through until I started my PhD, until I started my undergrad studies.
What happened? What draws a 6 or 7 year old into something like that?
I think the biggest influence on me was probably I had a cousin. His name is Sam Giel.
Huh?
He was like a uh, Trotskyist,
Mm.
socialist in the UK, very active though as well in the like Free Tibet movement. So uh, you know, he was very left wing, but also very China skeptical. So anyway, it was, I think more than anyone, he probably influenced my political thinking. My grandmother,
What, he was a writer? How would you have found him at 6 years old?
well, he's my cousin.
Oh, he's your
So,
cousin. Got it. Got it.
in London, yeah. And we visited him, he visited us. And
Mm.
I think I first got exposed to and thinking about politics through
Wow.
interacting with him. But my grandmother, who is our common grandmother, was always very politically engaged as well, and to a lesser
Wow.
extent, parents. So
Wow. 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 That's amazing. I've never even heard of anything like that. So you go to boarding school. Well, how old are you when you go to boarding school?
I was 13.
13. What was that experience like?
Um, well, what led me there was a little bit bizarre. So I was, this socialist, and then I was sort of like a skater punk going along with it. I started doing very badly in school in my
Mm.
6th grade year. And then in the summer between my 7th and 8th grade year, my father gave me Atlas Shrugged to read
Oh, yeah.
by Ayn Rand, thinking maybe it would reform me in some way. And it totally changed my life.
Huh.
Um, I moved from being like a multicolored hair skater punk, not, kind of failing out of school, to having the highest grades in my class, spending all my spare time reading classic economics books. And I actually ended up hanging out with people at the Hoover Institution, wrote a
Uh-huh.
letter to Milton Friedman.
Oh, you
And
got to meet Milton Friedman?
I did not actually. He responded to my letter, even though he lived at the Hoover Institution. He did not respond to my follow-up asking him to come over for tea. So I missed the chance to meet him, but I do have a letter from him.
I heard
Uh,
he was so generous with the letter writing.
yeah, he was amazing, and he said, I said, yeah. Anyway, so that was a defining moment, and I read, tons and tons of classic economics.
Huh.
I decided I wanted to leave home and go to boarding school, based on that. And I ended up at a place called Choate Rosemary Hall in Connecticut.
Oh, okay. Okay. When you say that you were reading all these classical economists, sounds like you're saying I'm not just reading like classical liberal. You were reading what, like 19th century Adam Smith types of people, or what?
Yeah, Adam Smith. I mean, worldly philosophers, the original texts of a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
classic things that are mentioned in the worldly philosophers, classic history of economic thought book. I read a lot of the Austrians. I read
Mm.
all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And it was just really captivating. So that's like your initial falling in love with economics is Ayn Rand. And then
Ayn
and
Rand, and then it led me into all this other stuff. And then I, started hanging out with people at the Hoover institutions. There was a guy named Williamson Evers, who I think is still around, who's
hmm.
a education reform guy, and he got interested in me and introduced me to a bunch of people at Hoover and had me participate in some of his education reform
Oh,
work. And anyways, So that's what I did during my seventh and eighth grade years. I was really an arrogant jerk, very isolated from my classmates.
Uh-huh.
Really, I think honestly, pretty cruel
Yeah.
to a lot of them. But it was a big change in my development and ended up leading me to go to boarding school. So
Wow. Wow. At boarding school, does this continue? You're at boarding school, you're just continuing to invest in this kind of economics and political thought? Because the
yeah, so
author
a
is like
bunch
classical
of
liberal.
fun things happened at boarding school. So because of the Ayn Rand thing, my politics changed a lot,
Yeah.
and I ended up being very active in the Republican Party. I um, worked on the Steve Forbes campaign.
Yeah.
And I had worked in California before that on a guy named Tom Campbell, who was running for Senate there.
Mm.
And then I co-founded with a guy from Florida named Fritz Brogan, who's still in Republican politics, something called Teenagers for Republican Victory, which was one of the top teenage Republican organizations. And I
Wow.
ended up attending the George W. Bush inauguration in 2001
Mm. So
and
you just
leading.
had this like it wasn't just that you were interested in politics. You've got this like real entrepreneurial streak even back then that you're wanting to like go out and make things that aren't there.
Yeah, so I was very into organizing, and I ended
Huh.
up leading the Teenage Republicans at Choate. And ironically, the leader of the Teenage Democrats when I was doing that was actually Ivanka Trump. She was a
Mm.
senior when I was a freshman. So,
Oh,
yeah,
y'all knew each other?
not really. I mean, but we met each other a couple times. But
Mm.
again, she was a senior when I was a freshman, so I was just like taking over the leadership of the Republicans while she was sort of leaving the leadership of the Democrats. So
Oh,
very,
okay.
very ironic,
Okay.
given
So do you graduate from this boarding school?
I did, yeah.
Oh, so what when you are graduating at the end, if I could have like gone into the faculty teacher lounge and just kind of like, hovered and eavesdropped, what would they have said? Glenn is this kind of student, or Glenn is gonna be like this. What do you think they would have said?
I was involved in a variety of different fields. So I was, at that time, I thought I was either going to be a physicist or do something political.
Mm.
That's what I thought I was going to do when I graduated. I did a capstone paper, which is quite interesting to read now, looking back for me, when I was a senior in high school, because it actually picks up on a lot of themes that I kind of developed later in a way that I was really surprised to see when I would look back on it that it did.
Mm.
It actually reads a little bit like my writing now.
Yeah.
Uh, but I was also on the economics team, doing national competitions and so forth. So I was sort of in physics, politics, economics, and I had a professor teacher named David Doster, who was my math teacher. And he said that he was confident that I, would go into economics for a while, but that I wouldn't stay in that field, that my
Oh.
interests were not going to be served by just being in economics. And when he said that to me, which he didn't even say until I had already gotten my PhD, uh,
Oh.
but uh, I was kind of skeptical at the time, but he turned out to be exactly right. So, anyways, that was
That's
interesting.
funny. You think that what do you because in some ways I look at you and I think of those classical economists, these big ideas about the organization of society at large, intersecting with political economy. And so my first thought would be, yeah, he's going to be an economist forever. How could he ever get tired of it? But
Yeah.
something must have been visible to the outsiders.
Yeah, so my mathematics teacher and I had another one, David Quarfoot, they were very good friends with each other. Both of them, I think, had a sense that I wasn't going to be in economics forever, that it was part of my journey, but it wasn't the whole thing. And I think
Mm.
that very much ended up being the case. Looking back on it now, I think of my journey from left to right, and then from the left-right spectrum to the sort of econ technocratic way of thinking about things, all as just being steps navigating different polarities that then later, emerge into something else. So
Yeah. So at the end of high school, what did you want to be when you grew up?
either a physicist or a politician.
Or a
So
politician?
those were what I was thinking of going into Princeton.
Got it.
And at the very early, did the prep for physics, and I did the prep for going into something called the Woodrow Wilson School.
Yeah.
which was sort of public policy, public affairs,
Okay.
which
Okay.
is where my wife ultimately graduated from. So.
Okay. Okay. So you go to Princeton. I mean, I'm sure you had a lot of hard choices to make. You probably had a lot of options. Was there something about Princeton that was particularly attractive?
Well, it's funny because when I applied, when I was thinking about applying, I had heard Princeton was more conservative than other leading schools, and that was part of my attraction.
Oh,
But
yeah.
but actually, my politics were changing at the time.
Mm,
And so by the time I applied early decision. By the time that everybody else was making selections, I kind of regretted having chosen Princeton and would have instead probably have gone to Yale had I had
mm.
not applied early. But anyway, so I ended up at Princeton for reasons that were kind of not actually very relevant.
Yeah.
But a lot of things like that happen in life. A lot of things in life, uh, you can tell a story about them in reverse, but actually the reason why it happened is often sort of chance.
Yeah, sure, sure. So a lot of people, in college, I mean, but your stuff happened a lot earlier, but I'm wondering, were there any new books or new classes or new professors at Princeton that created a new spark in you about economics?
It's actually interesting. I mean, there's certainly some amount of that, but I would actually say that in some ways, my college years were almost the opposite in the sense that what I did in college was what I think a lot of people do during their PhDs. I got laser focused on being like, the best economist, the fastest economist, the most prolific economist,
Mm,
rather than that expansion of horizons.
mm,
I think to a large extent that had happened for me earlier. Uh,
mm,
and I ended up having this mentor, Jose Shankman, who
mm.
got into his head the notion that I should do my PhD very quickly. And so
Oh,
I ended up, sort of focusing a lot. And of course, I got lots of wonderful new ideas and doing lots of different things. And there were many things I did then that actually resonated with me later. So my first published paper was actually in philosophy and economics,
oh,
not in economics proper. And that ended up having an idea that, again, is one of these things where it left me for a number of years, but looking back, it ended up being much more relevant and influential to what I'm doing today in many ways than the work I did in between the
that's a
standard
solo
work.
authored paper you did in college or grad school?
I wrote it as an undergraduate paper, continued to work on it, and then it was published 2 years after I graduated undergrad, I believe, or maybe 1 year after,
Mm.
just as I was starting my postdoc. So
Mm. So when you're at Princeton, you go in this area, I'm assuming, of industrial organization,
no,
marketing
I wasn't. I didn't get
platforms.
into
No,
IO
that's not
at
right.
all as an undergrad.
Oh,
I didn't take a single IO class at Princeton
oh,
ever. Yeah,
okay.
I my fields were finance and microtheory.
In
Uh,
at undergrad, are you saying in grad school?
well, the thing is, there wasn't really a distinction because I did my all my PhD classes while I was an undergraduate.
Oh,
And so I was ABD when I was a graduate student.
when you
So
got into the grad school, you were already ABD?
yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So your field is micro theory and finance.
Yeah, and Jose, those were Jose's interests, and he was my very, very close mentor.
Hmm.
So, but I also worked with Roland Benabou and Hyun Song Shin, and then Jean Tirole at Toulouse was someone I visited. I had spent the summer of my between my junior and senior years at the Justice Department, and that had been what had got me interested in IO. I had no exposure to IO before that, and then
Hmm.
the basis of that and the work I did there and developing of that, Roland introduced me to Jean, and I ended up spending a bunch of time in France working with and learning from Jean.
That was while you were at Princeton.
Yeah, so I did my undergrad and grad at Princeton. I visited Toulouse, France, I believe in the late fall of my senior year. Uh,
Hmm.
And that was my first visit there. And then was for the next 7 years to spend 1 month there every year.
Wow. So Tyrol leaves a big impression on you. It's very clear from your writing, but like, how would you phrase it?
I mean, Tyrol is just as a human being, even more than as an economist, he's a very kind, gentle, generous person, very intellectually curious, very um, disciplined and inquisitive and yet open-minded. So definitely he was a big influence on my life.
Mm,
Jose was probably an even bigger influence on my life, but Jean was
mm,
as well. And as I mentioned, some of my mentors in other fields, like Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is my mentor in philosophy, was a major
mm.
influence. Um, and then during my postdoc, I did work with biologists. That was my second published paper. So actually, my first published real core econ paper, which was in the AER, I think, was actually my third published paper. My first one was in philosophy. My second one was in biology.
Huh.
Um,
So what kind of person is it you're describing? This is this like, I mean, my response is that you're very curious and you just sort of go where you where you see you want to go, but is there like a broader pattern that's forming in this, like a research agenda or something?
I mean, I don't think I had it conceptualized as such at that age. I think at that age, I was just curious, exploring, uh, you know, in the space of being conflicted between, on the one hand, being driven to be, I'm the youngest, I'm the this. So I wanted to just be on a very linear track and
Uh,
chase rewards. And that was a big part of it. And at the same time, I was very sort of omnivorous, curious, attracted by these different things. So I was navigating those uh,
hmm.
twin things. And it was kind of the conflict between those things, I think, that led to a lot of the developments later. So
That's interesting. You say the chasing of the rewards. Can you tell me a little bit about what rewards you were chasing and what were
well,
you hoping to
so
get out of them?
in my PhD, I had three essays. One was an IO essay. One was an essay about how when people have differences in beliefs, financial markets can actually increase risk.
Mm.
Um, and one was an essay about like applying machine learning to econometrics.
What year is this? This is what, like oh 08,
2008 was my PhD.
2008? Okay.
So at the time,
The
the
machine learning can do what? What was
to
it?
econometrics,
Machine learning and economy. Oh, that's very
yeah, yeah,
early. Yeah.
yeah. So no one was working on that at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. Hmm.
And no one was working on the financial crisis happens right about then. So no one was
Mm.
working on the like everyone totally dismissed the finance thing and the econometrics thing.
They
None of
didn't
them
see any
worked as
value in it.
efficient.
What
Yeah.
those essays?
They,
Okay.
they 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 were like, this is like all this machine learning stuff. It's just a fancy form of not of non-parametric regression. Like, what are you talking? There's nothing here,
Hmm.
and um and the finance stuff. They're like, this is some weird decision theory thing. Like, what are you talking about? Differences in beliefs, like just Pareto principle, whatever. So everyone
Hmm.
dismissed those things. And on the other hand, the work I was doing in IO. Right then, President Obama got elected, and Joe Farrell and Carl Shapiro, who had been big fans of and using this work on pass-through I'd been doing,
Hmm.
got into this position of power and started rewriting the merger guidelines and asked me to basically consult on helping them rewrite the merger guidelines and provide the econ
Wow.
foundation for what became the 2010 merger guidelines. So there was like one set of my work, which was this curious, weird stuff that didn't fit in the profession that I got very negative signals on.
Yeah.
And then there was this other stuff that I got positive, signals on.
Major
And
positive signal.
because I was young, because I was, everything was like, I'm the first this, and like that was my shtick. I followed the signals,
Yeah,
and I
sure.
went in the IO direction.
Yeah.
Not because that's where my heart was, not that's because that where my passion was. That's what I was getting the signals on.
Yeah.
And that let me do a lot of these young things and whatever.
Mm.
But looking back, I actually am kind of, if anything, a little embarrassed of the work I did then. I think on net it was harmful, probably.
Harmful to yourself or harmful
To the
work?
world. Like I don't,
Oh,
I think it reinforced and cemented a paradigm that was basically broken.
huh.
Um, and on the other hand, that other stuff that I did, we know how influential AI has become in econometrics. And frankly,
Yeah.
I don't even think the ways that it's been done actually get at the real potential there. I don't think
Mm.
people have actually gotten at what I was trying to get at the time, honestly.
Mm.
But it, became a huge thing, obviously.
Hmm.
And um, and the finance stuff, that's been the foundation of a lot of, the work that Alp Simsek has done um, since then. So like both of those became huge things. The
Yeah.
IO stuff that I did became very, I think minor, discredited in my view. I mean, I'm not saying the profession doesn't appreciate it, but I don't
Hmm.
think it was a positive contribution.
Hmm.
So um,
This is the multi-sided platform, the price theory work,
yeah, and the
multi-sided platform.
pass-through paper, like all my most cited papers
Uh-huh.
are in that tradition.
Well, how did it feel to you at the time to be working on something that you weren't passionate about, but that you're getting these positive signals on? You're clearly like a very competent person, so you're able to get out of bed and work on something. But how did it feel? Did you not enjoy it?
It was very much in the competitive hill climbing, I'm the best, elbowing people, being I think it drove me. I think many people who knew me at that time think of me as like typification of econ jerk,
Mm.
And I think that was true. So I think my negative reputation for many in the profession is probably well earned.
Well, that's
Uh,
funny because you said when you were younger that you even had elements of that too, that you had been.
Absolutely.
So it's just sort of like it might be just part of this journey that you were on, this part of this growing.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think getting all the positive reinforcement early, getting all these, you're the this, you're the that, valedictorian, whatever, were very much reinforcing my worst tendencies, my
Mm.
scraping and, uh, competitive and that kind of an attitude, you know.
Mm.
And I think the best things that happened to me were that ran into conflicts with the other parts of myself. And then that forced me to go in a different direction or, led me to go in a different direction. So,
Does something happen while you're in government? Like an existential kind of reflection or something like that?
I mean, basically, I had a very interesting, when I was still completing my postdoc, I was visiting. Actually, no, no, it wasn't. I was actually an assistant professor at Chicago at that time.
Mm.
And I come up with, back in 2009, this idea that became quadratic voting.
You came up
Um,
with it in '09 while you were a
in
postdoc at
'09,
Chicago.
yeah, in
You were an
some work I was,
assistant professor at Chicago.
at '09, I wasn't. At '09, I was still at the Harvard Society of Fellows doing my
Okay.
post. But then I had a
So you've
conversation.
done this work at government. You've kind of like you've like proven yourself as being, that you're capable of this, but it was dissatisfying a little bit. Now you're at Harvard Society of Fellows.
Yeah, and that I was still mostly doing the IO work at that time. Like that was
Okay.
still my main focus. But I came up with this quadratic voting idea, but because of this other stuff, I shelved it. And for 2 years, I
Mm.
didn't really do much work on it. And then I was at Chicago. I had lunch with Steve Levitt, and I just told him about this idea. And he was like, "You should drop everything and work on this. It's way more interesting and important than what you're doing."
Really?
So I spent 2 months in a sprint getting it down on paper. And over the course of the coming years, I tried to make that work, fit and work with economics. And I developed some other work that was sort of in a similar vein. And I I thought, I shared Steve's view that it was way more important than the things I was doing.
Yeah.
And I tried to do it in the econ context. And it just didn't work. It's just like you couldn't make that kind of stuff that was innovative in that way work with economics.
What happened?
And
You're
so,
sending it to journals and they're just like, this is weird.
I mean, basically I mean, you can go into like the details of exactly what, the sequence of responses was, but basically, I don't think the profession can process things that are really of practical importance and changing things that cannot be completely tied up all the loose ends in a
Oh,
way that is normative for the profession. Like,
Oh.
if the idea, like if the idea is, like getting at some core thing that changes the way you think about something, of course, to like fully mathematically prove every aspect of it would be the project of years and years and years and years, right?
Yeah.
So if all you've got is a lot of, if you've got the proof of some things, but then there are aspects of what make it important that cannot be fully proved or that have to be dealt with in a less formal way, the journals just can't process that. They don't,
Mm,
even if everyone thinks it's really interesting,
mm,
even if people react to it and being like, that's something profound, that you're really getting into
mm,
different and profound, they
mm-hmm,
can't make sense of it. And
mm,
so, for personal reasons, by that time, when I was really hitting that fact, like it would get to, some stage at all the journals, but then there'd just be, we can't. And I went through, so then I ended up saying in 2016 that I had a few things like this that I thought really, really mattered, but that didn't really fit. And I
mm,
remembered what had happened with the AI stuff I'd been doing and the finance stuff I'd been doing and how I'd let that kind of go, even though
right.
it's been there. And I just said, I'm not going to do that anymore. Like I'm at a stage where I can just go off and do what I think is important.
Yeah.
And so I ended up saying, I'm just going to write a book about this because I think, all this stuff with Trump and so forth and Brexit is happening in the world of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I have something important to say to that world. Like my
Mm,
instincts from earlier when I'd been in politics that this was really mattered,
yeah.
and it wasn't being processed by econ. And that wasn't going to be the way to get it out there. And so I just wrote a book about it. And so
This is
that
the
led
book with Eric Posner?
exactly, yeah.
Oh, Eric, how is this match made? I know he's at Chicago, but is that like you guys just really had some chemistry immediately? He saw what you were trying to do, or what's
When
going
I
on?
first arrived at Chicago, I decided that, to satisfy this curiosity and this experience from Society of Fellows I had of interacting with people from different disciplines,
Yeah.
I went through the faculty directory of University of Chicago and I came up with a list of about 300 faculty members who I thought I might have some interesting overlap with. And over the
Mm-hmm.
course of the 3 years I was at Chicago, I had lunch with a different faculty member every day, and I got to know
Mm,
these people. And Eric was one I really hit it off with, and we saw these older things that I had written, the things about finance and econometrics. By that time, other economists had taken them and run with them.
right.
And so I wanted to do something with it. And Eric said, why don't we write a policy piece
Yeah.
about this? And that was my first law review piece. We wrote
Oh,
a piece about like the finance ideas.
what year
And
is that?
I
Oh
think it came out
nine,
in 2011.
11. Okay.
Yeah. I think it's Northwestern Law Review or
And
something.
you're
Anyway,
at Chicago still? You're still an
I'm at
assistant professor?
I'm at Chicago as assistant professor working with Eric. I think that came out, maybe it was 2012, but it came out like during my second year as an assistant professor or something.
Mm-hmm.
And and so from that time on, sort of all these ideas that didn't quite fit or I couldn't make work, my instinct was to go and work with Eric on them. So I
Yeah.
I ended up writing a bunch of law review pieces with Eric about all of these things.
Yeah.
And then it just was natural when I decided, let me communicate this more broadly to work with him on that. So
Oh, what's the econ department thinking while you're sort of blossoming? Do they understand you? I know Levitt seems to, but is it just typical? You're like
I
many
mean,
assistant professors that go through that
there's a
department?
heterogeneous thing there. I always had very, very strong support and mentorship from Gary Becker.
Yeah.
And, he passed away just as I left Chicago. And it really felt like that was the moment for me to leave because
Mm,
he was really the person who had always been most supportive of me being curious in this way. And I ended up running a seminar with him and Eric's father, and a sociologist. Um, and, uh, but I think the overall perspective in the department was they were intrigued by me. But I also think I was a bit weird for them. And as I mentioned, I was kind of a jerk as well at this time.
mm,
So I think that got me a bit of a negative vibe.
Mm,
And Chicago encouraged that in a lot of ways. It is a seminar culture that's kind of famous for that type of behavior. And in my competitive and hill climbing mentality, sort of, I think, compensated for my weirdness by also being a jerk. So,
yeah. What's the positive version of this? I've gone through like about 1 billion hours of therapy, and so
yeah,
the negative self-talk, I
yeah,
always kind of feel like there's a positive thing that's going
yeah.
on. What's the positive thing going on with you sort of quote being a jerk and all that? Is there something deeper that's actually admirable?
Well, look, I think that I think there's a lot of things that I came to and learned and accomplished during that period. Um, uh, and I think that I was working through a lot of these different conflicting strands, and I think it made a lot of what I was able to do possible later. But I think, a fundamental thing for me was that I matured intellectually much, much faster than other people.
Yeah.
And I sort of physically and socially, I matured more slowly as a result, you
Right.
know?
Right,
And
right, right,
so,
right.
so other people were kind of having to process this mismatch where I
Mm,
was intellectually ahead, maybe in some ways even ahead of the field, like what the field was able to deal with, you know what I
hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
But I was physically and socially immature.
Mm,
Uh, and they were having to put up with that mismatch relative,
mm.
so I like both came off as sort of precocious and uh, you know, like actually challenging to them intellectually, and then kind of a jerk and not, knowing what I was supposed to be doing. I
Yeah.
mean, that being said, I think many of my students found that invigorating. And I think the set of students that I had during that time, mostly undergraduates, a couple graduates, but mostly undergraduates, have ended up like a shocking fraction of them being in economics and being very close to each other because
Mm.
I I pushed them and I put them in a situation of really being in the midst of real economic thinking. So
Yeah.
there were lots of good elements to that, and I definitely think many people, especially in other fields at the university, because I was constantly reaching out, have positive memories of my contributions there. But I
Yeah.
think in econ, because I felt sort of pressured and boxed in, I think I externalized
Yeah.
a lot of that in a way that was tough for
Mm.
others. So
Yeah, it's so funny. Like I'll oftentimes say to undergrads, if you go into econ, you can kind of do anything. You got a guy like Gary Becker that studies crime in the family, and then you've got more traditional fields. And you're saying actually for your personality, it was like a cage, or
yeah,
academic economics was like a cage.
absolutely. Yeah, I
Huh.
was I was trapped, and as a caged animal like lashes out, and so I think that made it not very fun for me to be around me, especially among people who were economists.
Yeah.
Like for people in other fields, I think it was exciting to have an economist who wanted to interact with them and who felt freedom in interacting with them. You know what I mean? But
Well, so this book, what doors does it open for you? Because is the book sort of, confounding the leaving? Like are these like causally related? The book comes out and then you decide to leave, or what happens exactly when the book
yeah, I
comes?
mean, I think the book was the moment of leaving in a way that I didn't even fully understand at the time. But basically, the most important thing that ended up happening with the book was that even before the book came out, some people in the Web3 blockchain, at the time it was called blockchain, now it's called Web3 world, discovered some of the papers that went into the book and started tweeting
Oh,
about them. And
oh,
so I ended up in a correspondence with Vitalik Buterin.
yeah.
Um, and I
This
asked if
is
he
the
wanted
creator of the Ethereum
Ethereum.
Bitcoin. Yeah, the Ethereum, right?
Ethereum blockchain, yeah.
Yeah,
So he ended up asking to look at the manuscript of the book that was not out yet, and I sent it to him. And he
yeah,
sent, and at the time I was very negative on blockchain. I was very skeptical, and I didn't even know who Buterin was, but he seemed to me like he's this like Russian Canadian, like 20 something with all this money, like he must be some kind of a gangster. You know what I mean?
yeah.
And I sent him the book, and he sent me back like 20 of the most pages of the most thoughtful comments I'd ever gotten on anything,
Oh,
and
wow.
way deeper than what I got from my econ colleagues, on
Uh,
anything like this. And so I was like, well, maybe there's something to this guy. And so that ended up leading me sort of gradually to move into that world. As the book came out, I ended up,
Were
in
you
sort of,
surprised that radical markets and the underlying papers would have this appeal to blockchain?
well, at the time I didn't know anything about blockchain world, so yes. But as I've come to learn more about it, the logic makes more sense.
Uh,
So, but at the time I was surprised. I had no idea about
yeah,
any of this. I
yeah.
just knew that I was on, Twitter, and that there were people, I wasn't very heavily on Twitter. I was on it mostly just to, like, follow restaurants or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And but then I got all this attention from Vitalik. And so that led me into that world and to thinking about it and interacting with it and working with Vitalik and with others.
And are
And
you
that
still at
really,
Chicago? Is this still Chicago?
no, I left from Microsoft at this point. So I
Okay,
left,
okay,
I left, I left in 2014 from Chicago,
okay.
for mostly personal reasons, but also, as I said, it was at the same time that Gary Becker passed away, and
Right,
he was
right.
my mentor, and so it ended up
Mm.
being a logical time for me to be leaving. And I left mostly to follow my wife's career. She got a postdoc and a assistant professorship at Harvard and Princeton.
Oh, so
And
you wanted to be
so
in the New
I wanted to
England
be
area.
there, New England, New York. And Microsoft had labs in both New York and Boston. And so it was one
Mm.
of the only places I could go that would allow me to follow her around. So that
I
was
would
great.
think this is again, if I just with just limited priors, I would have thought that being at Microsoft, a big profit maximizing giant firm, would be the cage, and being the academic would be the no cage. And is it the opposite of that? I mean,
Totally the opposite for me because,
huh,
uh, you know, uh, every like one thing I've learned that I didn't know at the time, but one thing I've really learned is this usual econ imagination that, like, oh, I'm in the academy, I can do whatever I want. Like, people at profit maximizing companies have to go. Like, that's complete garbage. Like, every part of society operates according to some logic.
mm,
And what it means that you can, quote, do whatever you want in econ is that you've internalized that logic rather than it being
uh,
externally imposed upon you.
can you give
So,
me an example of what the logic is for academic economics?
oh yeah, I mean, like, to a first approximation, you kind of have to, like, write like things that can easily be done as mathematical theorems, or you have to do things that can easily be done as, like, the effect of some particular cause,
Yeah,
or you need to write a structural model, you know, and, like, things that are easily organized in that way are what is academic econ. And
right.
your whole mind shapes around those. And plus, all those are surrounded by these parameters of the maximizing individual, and,
Yeah.
the social is pushed away. There's this, like, whole trope of the, planner and the individual. Like, that's how everything is structured, and you're supposed to
Mhm.
approach every issue that way. And in fact, it's very funny because when I used to, when I was in econ, whenever I saw something that, like, followed an econ logic in literature, I got really excited, and I would write, the JPE. I have like 10 JPE back cover quotes because I would pull these things out of literature and history and whatever.
Mhm.
But what I've come to realize afterwards is that, like, the fraction of things I read in history and literature that lined up with one of these econ things was, like, the reason it was so exciting was it was like you would see one thing every, several months of reading literature, you would see one thing that was like that. And
Mm.
now, with the toolkit that I've come to have, everything I read in literature and whatever I can make sense of,
Uh-huh.
because I've been freed from that being my mental frame. You know what I
Uh,
mean?
yeah. 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 So, okay. Two things happen. The book connects you with the gentleman that's
Tutoring.
created.
Yeah.
Yes. And then also you're at Microsoft. And so you've got this, like, two twin uh opening of two new careers. Is that right? But is it really just
Yeah.
one thing?
Well, I mean, I moved to Microsoft as a researcher, very much thinking I'm just an economist, I'm just doing my thing. But I'm in this new environment where my colleagues are not economists.
Yeah.
Like, I have an economist or two colleague, but I have computer scientists, I have sociologists. I have a much broader set of colleagues.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'm writing this book that is taking me in this broader range of directions,
Yeah.
and that is bringing these people in. And those things kind of converge and give me the opportunity to shift what I'm doing. And at the same time, um, my manager at Microsoft, who is very much a mentor, Jennifer Chase, was also leaving Microsoft
Mm.
and moving on. And I'd gotten to know through a sequence of things we can talk about some people who are more on the corporate leadership side of Microsoft. I got to know the CEO of Microsoft. I got to know the CTO of Microsoft. I worked with them and some of the people that work with them. So I ended up actually then leaving at Microsoft my role as a researcher and moving to be a geopolitical advisor to the CTO,
Wow.
um, just as all the big investments in AI were happening.
When is this?
So
This is like 2018 something?
2019.
2019?
Yeah, the year
Oh,
after
wow.
the book came out. So
Huh. The book you think has something to do with this?
absolutely, because in the book led me to basically no longer be a researcher. I ended up founding a nonprofit. I
Huh.
ended up writing a lot of stuff for the public. I ended up giving lots of talks in different places, being in the blockchain world. So I didn't feel like a researcher anymore. And so it felt more
Mm.
natural for me to do something to contribute to Microsoft, as a company, et cetera. And in fact, I was working with the office of the CTO at the time, which was very small at that time,
Mm.
on things related to the book.
Mm.
So
What is
yeah.
your skill set that you're learning through this? I mean, because, before that, you're just very, very smart. You're an excellent economist. And what are the skills that you didn't, that surprised you that, are now a big part, that became a big part of your productivity?
I mean, I think that parts of people develop, they don't really fundamentally change. And the
Uh-huh.
thing that I had before always was that I was always meeting different people and different ideas and finding connections among them.
Yeah.
I was meeting these 300 professors, as I mentioned, but that skill is not really valued in the academy.
Yeah.
Um, in corporate world, they have a name for it. They call it networking, you
Right.
know, and it is really valued. Like and that became core to my job at the office of the CTO. So what was this weird trait of me went to being like core to what I had to do. And I
Yeah.
went from being very marginal at Microsoft and being off, in this research lab in New England that wasn't connected to the company to being one of the more network central people in Microsoft, connecting people all across the company.
Oh.
So,
That had
um,
to feel really good, especially since you were saying you felt, at least you made a comment that your social, you've made all these comments about your personality not being very nice to people
yeah.
and socially mature. Now all of a sudden it sounds like it's extremely sophisticated social skills.
Yeah, I mean, during my 30s, during that time I was at Microsoft writing the book and so forth, I think I started to mature along some of those dimensions. And,
Yeah.
I had children right at the end of my time before I went into the office of the CTO. And, that whole process, I think, was very important to helping that mature, but also just being given the permission to focus on that networking, to be focused on that social,
Mm,
those connections, I think was very helpful to me in moving away from the I got to be the best, I got to be the first,
mm.
I got to be on top of this pecking order, and I got to shove people aside, who are in my way, and to an attitude of we're stronger when we harness the people around us and connect them and empower them rather than be out front. So
I've never really thought about this before, but it's like the eigenvector. It sounds like your eigenvector centrality is kind of high, and and then I'm thinking, you said you're just, you're writing in philosophy, you're writing in biology, you're doing this in econ, and it sounds like you're just multilingual, and you can end up talking to lots of different people, and connecting them. Is that accurate?
well, yeah, I think that was always to some extent true intellectually. And what started happening is I found a context in which that was sort of
Mm,
valued and highlighted, and that pushed me into maturing along a lot of the dimensions that had been missing in the past. So
right.
that wasn't sort of an abstract intellectual property of me, and it became more of a personal trait over time, which is, I think, was an important thing that had to happen.
Well, so now you have this new book, Plurality, the Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy with Audrey Tang. And I was wondering first, who is Audrey Tang and what is the origin story of this book before we actually get into it?
Yeah, so Audrey Tang is the digital minister of Taiwan. She's the first, arguably the first digital minister in the world,
Yeah.
and also the first, and now there's a lot of them actually. You probably know Fedorov in Ukraine and so forth. But she's also the first transgender minister anywhere in the world.
Oh.
Um, and she, in the traditional Mandarin, and actually that's a part of the title you didn't say because it's a little hard to pronounce, but in traditional Mandarin that they use in Taiwan, the characters Shu Wei, which are part of the title of the book, mean both digital and plural at the same time.
Oh, okay.
And that has a lot of meanings for her because she's non-binary. So it
Mm,
means that, but it also means digital and it means pluralism. So she's all those things wrapped into one. I met her
mm,
in 2018, thanks to Vitalik, who connected us. One of her associates was in New York for a conference and met me in a like hipster cafe in Brooklyn
uh-huh.
co-working space, and we had a call with Audrey, and she ended up using some of the ideas that I developed, these quadratic voting ideas that I mentioned from Levitt in Taiwan, and I then ended up meeting her in person in Germany in the end of 2019, uh,
Mm.
just before COVID things happened.
What's the chemistry between y'all?
Well, when I first met her, um, it was a very interesting encounter. We went to see a bunch of German government officials,
Mm,
and I'd never met anyone like her. She was, I have met plenty of Nobel laureates, et cetera, all these smart people. Her intellect was on a different order of magnitude, even than any of those people that I've met, even than the Kevin Murphys or the Jean Tirolles or whatever. And at the same time, she was, again, totally opposite to these, the usual econ thing. Just so quiet and humble, and also energy and thoughts were never emanating from her.
mm,
They were always from the people around her. She was a catalyst. She was I don't know if you know Bruce Lee and this idea of be the water, which
mm,
which of course comes from Taoism, and then goes into Eastern martial arts.
mm,
But she's a liquid. She's a gas. She's not a solid.
mm,
Um, Everything that she does, every energy comes from others.
mm,
And, it was so clear meeting with these people that she was the smartest person in the room and also the quietest person in the room, also the person
mm,
who was most just supporting and the others around her.
mm,
And it that blew me away. What the things that she taught me intellectually, but also the way that she was blew me away.
mm,
And it ended up leading me over the course of the coming years to really kind of devote my entire life to supporting her mission.
mm. What's her
And
mission?
uh, well, I don't think she would say she has a mission because she doesn't act that way. As I said, energy never comes from her. It always comes from those around her. And but what she does, she lives in the way of the Tao Te Ching. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but
Mm-mm.
it's an amazing book. One of the most powerful things I've ever read.
Mm,
And Audrey lives that scripture in a way I've never
mm,
seen someone live their scripture.
mm,
Um, but she also has a job description at the Taiwanese Ministry of Digital Affairs that she runs, that she wrote in 2016 when she first became a minister. And this, I'll read it to you. She said, "When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality.
mm,
When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And when we hear the singularity is near, let us remember the plurality is here.
Okay, what is she talking about? This is probably the core thesis of your book or something, right?
Yeah, so I mean, this was the seed from which the book grew.
Uh-huh.
Um, that mission statement that she has.
Yeah.
And yeah, as I said, kind of most of my life she wrote that 2 years before I met her. And then since then, most of my life has come to be supporting this. I'm now executive director of a film about her life, which we just finished, actually. I just got the cut of it 2 days ago.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and I'm, writing this book with her. I, have founded these institutions with her. Pretty much everything I do now is about these ideas, but these ideas really are just a window into something that is in her soul that you
Mm,
can't really understand unless you meet her. And
mm,
it's in the Tao Te Ching. It's these are just ways to try to put into words that way of being.
mm, mm. What are you so what is it that you're trying to do in this book? It's a big book, it's 400 pages long. I mean, what are you trying to get across in the book?
I think the book is called Plurality, or Shui Plurality, and uh, it will mean different things to different people. There's
Mm-hmm.
no simple one slice on it. And in fact, I think one of the most moving things for me has been if you look at the endorsements of the book at plurality.net/endorsements, we deliberately chose to seek and succeeded in getting endorsements that see the book all in completely different ways. So
Mm,
there's a quote from a guy who was one of the top evangelical advisors to Donald Trump, where he says that diversity and technology have been used to secularize us, but
mm.
that in the hands of the authors, they become a shield for the faithful.
Oh, wow.
That's one slice on it, right? But
Uh-huh.
another slice on it is there's someone who is the leader of the original Israeli protests that became the Occupy movement, the global Occupy movement.
Mm.
And she talks about it as a way of realizing the dreams they had in the Occupy movement.
Wow.
And then we have the first endorsement of a secular book from the Dalai Lama, where he wrote a poem about it.
Wow.
Um, and so it means many different things to many different people. Um, but let
That's
me
kind of what you say Audrey's superpower is, though.
exactly, yeah.
Huh.
So, but I'll say it to an econ audience, in a very econ way, because I think that's your audience, what it
Yeah.
is. Uh, I think the basic conceptual frame of econ is there's the social planner and there's individuals. And sometimes those are not individuals, sometimes they're firms, and sometimes the social planner is actually a firm. And then anyways, but there's always like there's the center and then there's the atoms. That's the basic econ frame on things. And
Hmm.
an alternative way to think about things is that is a complexity way of thinking about things, which is that there is no such thing as an individual. Individuals are actually these sort of loci of the intersection of social groups.
Mm.
And that, on the other hand, social groups are the intersection of individuals. And that really, rather than there being like private goods and the market that organizes their consumption, instead, what there really are is a variety of different social goods which we are collectively determining the allocation of, both
Mm.
between different social groups and what those social groups do themselves.
So, like, what's a social good that I would understand?
So right now, I can actually, maybe this will be fun. If you turn around my screen,
Yeah.
you'll see that I live on a lake.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Um, and of course, you could choose to take that lake and enclose it and give everyone extra space for a swimming pool each.
Hmm.
Um, and then you would have converted a common good into a private good, a
Yeah.
series of private goods.
Yeah.
But I think everyone would be worse off as a result of it. Um, that is an idea that I like to call, economists sometimes call it increasing returns. I would call it supermodularity. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think that is the most fundamental, that is the source of abundance. That's the source not of scarcity, but of opportunity and growth.
Uh,
And yet, because econ formulates itself as a science of scarcity, as a science of the allocation of goods, scarce goods among competing individual wants,
mm-hmm.
it doesn't see those things. Those are edge cases for it. And even quadratic voting, for example, you can prove in certain ways that it's an optimal system for allocating public goods, but it always has a background of most goods being private. And you can show that it's
Mm,
optimal if almost every good is private, and then there's one public good, and quadratic voting decides on that.
mm,
But if you actually are in where the background is shared goods of various kinds, and not
mm,
global, not like everything climate change. There are things like that lake that are shared among a community,
mm.
and there's a variety of communities. If that is the generic thing, and the private good and public goods are edge cases, you need a completely different conceptual framework than
Mm.
economics, I think.
So
Uh,
what does this have to do with property rights then? It sounds like it's directly gets at these problems of property rights.
it gets at property rights, it gets at identity, it gets at
Identity.
voting. All these things go from being different problems to being elements of the same problem. And this
Hmm.
book is really about if we were to take that richness and complexity as the problem and not think we're close to the proto frontier of this very simplistic private goods economy and we need to get to the proto frontier, but instead say we're not even remotely close to what's possible because that problem is so much harder. It is
Hmm.
like 10 orders of magnitude harder than what we're able to do now. How
Hmm.
would we start to build systems that can capture some of the richness of
Hmm.
that environment? And therefore, just as we moved from, writing to the telephone to video, because they captured more of reality
Hmm.
at a remote distance, can we start to design social systems that would do that? And
Yeah.
that's really what the book's about.
Well, who's the audience for this book? Is it going to be economists? Are you bringing economists back into the fold with some of this work that you're
I mean,
doing?
look, we have endorsements from Daron Acemoglu and Jason Furman, and Oded Galor, very prominent economists. So of course we want economists to engage with this, but they're not the primary audience for this.
Mm,
The primary audience for this is people in and around the technology world,
mm,
because they're people who are out there trying to build new things,
mm,
and we're trying to give them a direction to go with that. Because I'd love if economists were to engage in that project, but I don't think that that's the self-conception of economics.
mm,
So while we'd
mm.
love it to influence economists' thinking, ultimately they're not going to be at the core of the project that we're engaged in, I don't think, unless
Wow.
they change their perspective a lot.
Well, your journey is so fascinating. As an economist, I think it's like very, very hard to find someone like you. And it's exciting to hear your story. But I'm curious, where is this going? Where do you sort of see your future going? Because you're still young, and what's your where you want what do you want to be now when you grow up?
I don't, you know, think as many steps ahead as I used to.
Mm,
Um, and This is actually related to some things I write about. I think there's many people who think that if you're ambitious and forward looking, you think a lot of steps ahead.
yeah.
Um, but I actually have come to think that that's wrong. That actually any attempt to think a lot of steps ahead, given our limits, actually leads us to be very conservative.
Uh-huh.
The only way we can project far into the future is to repeat the patterns of the past.
Mm,
Um, and actually, what allows us to be innovative is to be agile,
mm,
is to, yes, have ambitious things that we want to do to put something new out there, but then to be receptive to what comes back to us from that. You know what
mm,
I mean? And not to plan it all out.
mm,
Because that because innovation is not an individual process. It's not the lone genius that puts it out there.
Mm.
It's actually a social process. And you need to push, you need to do something new, you need to have a spark, but then you need to see where that spark leads. What does it catalyze?
Yeah.
And that's very much like what's called pragmatism in philosophy,
Yeah.
Dewey style thinking. And that's become my, very much my approach.
Well, so, I always kind of feel like you should never go back in time and say, I wish I had done something different because, who knows the counterfactual, everything could be
Yeah.
much worse. But like, there are some people out there though. There's like, a young female PhD student in India, or, there's someone struggling at MTSU, Middle Tennessee State, or maybe someone at MIT who just feels like there's one path that they see in front of them, and they're told that's the path. And I'm just curious if you could just sit down with them. Obviously, I know you would listen to them, and it sounds like you would listen and hear their story. But let's say that you have listened and heard their story, and they've now asked you, what do you think now about somebody like me as your old self, that I need to know now, that you feel like would really benefit me now? What do you feel like is the one thing you wish you could just tell somebody?
The most common piece of advice like that I give people is that the new always comes from the recombination of the old. And if you seek freedom by going into econ, or you seek freedom by like going down some path like that, you are almost certainly heading for, a trap. But
Mm,
if you seek freedom from instead knowing that there are many, many different ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of acting in the world, and that none of them is the new. That all
right.
of those things that you can describe and see and be part of are the old. But there's no way to do something from a position of nowhere either.
Mm,
The only way is to jump between these different things, to see, to understand each, to really immerse yourself and socialize yourself on it, and to keep a remove, a detachment,
mm.
where you understand that that is not all,
Yeah.
that that is one lens, and that there's these other lenses, and that if you're going to do things, you're going to almost certainly have to jump between each of these different things,
Mm,
and so there's the Tao Te Ching does a good job of capturing this. Another thing that does a very good job is Rudyard Kipling's poem If. I don't know if
mm.
you've ever read that poem. It's a wonderful poem.
I don't think so.
But he says, I mean, among other things, it's advice to his son. And he says things like, if you can um, if you can walk with crowds without losing your virtue, and talk with kings without losing the common touch,
Mm,
um, if all men count with you, but none too much,
mm,
um, you know, that is the sort of thing that I would push towards people to see econ, to absorb it, to understand it, to feel it inside of you, to hold it inside of you, so that you know what an economist would do, and like how to be an economist, and yet for that not to be you,
mm, mm. Wow.
not to fully internalize it, to let it be a part of you, and yet not let it be you. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
Audrey often says that to be non-binary, to be plural, is to be most comfortable being on all sides of a debate.
Mm,
That often it is to live in that paradox, um, and not to be on no side, but to be on all sides, to truly
mm,
understand and appreciate and be identified with all of the conflicting sides in a dispute.
mm.
That is what I would say like that's where you get novelty. That's where you get innovation. That's where you push things forward, is when you can not reject the old, but embrace all the conflicting sides of the old, you know?
Yeah.
And then something new can come out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Glenn, this was surprisingly exciting. All my interviews are wonderful, but I didn't know what to expect because we'd never spoken before. Um, it's really wonderful, and I know that you've sort of are in this like post economist part of your life, but it's exciting to know that you're an economist and that you are saying that there are these paths that are out there, and there's a diversity of these paths out there. Because
Yeah.
I don't think we get that. We don't hear that. A lot of people can feel in that cage and trapped and not sure where they're supposed to go. So I really appreciate you sharing so much personal stuff. When is the book coming out? And what's it going to be
The
called? Who's it
book,
published with?
would love if people were to order the book the week of May 20th.
May
So hopefully
20th.
that'll be about when this is coming out. We're going to have several different versions of it. There'll be a paperback. There will be like a deluxe hardcover that will be in color.
Oh,
Um, and then there will be an ebook. You can always download it for free on the
yeah.
website as well,
Uh-huh.
because it has no copyright and it's built together with dozens of people around the world.
Yeah,
So
using this Gov forget thing. I didn't really
exactly.
understand what that is.
It's basically a self-governance software for open source projects.
Oh,
So everyone
this
who
has many
contributes,
authors. This book has
yeah,
many authors.
yeah, there's me and Audrey, and then there's dozens of people from around the world who
Wow.
get credit in the project using a community currency, and they can use that to determine the future direction of the project.
So
So
they use this quadratic voting in order to sort of
many
write the
things, many
book.
mechanisms put together. Quadratic
Oh,
voting is one of them, but all the sorts of things that are described in the book.
okay. Okay. Well, I'll put a link up on the Substack. And so we can get it on Amazon.
It'll be on Amazon, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Glenn, thank you so much for giving me your
Thank you,
time and
Scott.
giving
My
me your
pleasure
story.
for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, good luck with this book. And I'll hopefully our paths cross and I can
In
hear more of
person,
your
that'd be
story.
great. If you're ever in
All right.
Boston, drop by and come see the lake. So.
Yes, it looks wonderful. All right. I'll talk to you later.